Alright, so I'd like to just begin this series by discussing whether or not oral narratives are even important, and exactly what are they. Well, judging from my doing this series, you can probably guess that I definitely think that oral narratives are important when studying the Native American culture. And a lot of my reason for doing so just surrounds how much of the American Indian culture is bound up in oral narratives. They form such a comprehensive part of that culture that without understanding and studying oral narratives, it becomes extremely difficult to understand and study the American Indian culture. Over the past 30 years, there's been a great rise in the value that is placed on oral narratives and how they are studied and treated as an integral part of this culture. So I would just like to go in with that as the backdrop, and I will definitely go in future videos and discuss the ideas of why oral narratives are so important to that culture, and we will definitely go into that more in the future, but for right now, that's just where we'll start out. But what are oral narratives exactly? In short, they are pretty much just stories spoken out loud. As you can imagine, that's an extremely broad definition. There are so many different things that can fit under that definition. So the Western genre structures, which usually break down oral narratives and are commonly used in textbooks and anthologies, things like that, you have myths, which are stories generally about gods and take place a long time ago or in a place far away, and those tend to be much older in stories such as the creation stories and stories about floods and things like that. You also have legends, which are historical somewhat, or at least claim to be historical, but they tend to be more unauthenticated. You don't have clear contracts or evidence for them. There are also songs or chants as well as poetry. Wisdom, which just tends to be literature which has a purpose of conveying wisdom. So you may have parables and fables and things like that. And you also have humor, such as jokes, which actually is a large part of the Native American oral narratives, are jokes, which is interesting. You don't often think about that when you think of American Indian stories and oral narratives. Those are the general common genres for breaking down oral narratives. However, there are things which oral narratives certainly are not. And the first example of that would be that oral narratives are not easy to classify. They are not, Native American oral narratives are not easy to put into one of those genres because they may actually accompany a large amount of those genres in one story. Just as an example, you may have a story which is a chant, deals with religious material about the gods and how we were created, yet it also has historical elements to it and has a moral backbone or meaning that it is designed to convey, and has quite a few jokes. Now, that's a very full story, but when you think about it, one story in some Native American tribes may take over a month to tell because they just can become so large, and yet it's still one story, one oral narrative, and it has so many different elements in it. Thus, oral narratives don't often fall into easy to classify places where you can say, ah, yes, that's definitely a myth and nothing else. Instead, they tend to more just kind of have multiple genres that you can look at, but you can look at them through those lenses, and they are helpful in that respect. Another thing is that oral narratives aren't just entertainment. Often in our Western mindset, we look at oral narratives and we think, oh, it's just kind of like the Native American version of going to the movies, where, you have everyone sitting around a campfire listening to the story and it's just great fun. Now, there is an aspect of truth to that. Oral narratives are entertaining. If you have a storyteller who is boring and everyone just falls asleep, then obviously he's not a good storyteller, and his stories probably are not going to be passed down for generations to come. So Native American oral narratives definitely are entertaining, and they do have great times of humor and fun to them. However, They also are not just entertaining. There is a very important element of passing down tradition, of passing down morals, of passing down roles in society. This is who we are, and as a part of us, this is who you are. And that is a very common element to Native American stories, and I will be discussing that also in more depth in the future. But yes, so oral narratives are not just entertainment. Also, oral narratives are not just more individual stories. We often think of oral narratives as more like, I guess, again, movies or something like that, where you have the very clear beginning, rising action, climax, following action, and then end. Instead, however, Native American oral narratives more tend to form links in a chain or perhaps a web that just they all intersect and work together in a very clear way. And if you just look at one of them, it is very much more difficult to understand it than if you saw all the stories that it connected with, the overall narrative that it is a part of. So it's not like all Native American oral narratives ever fit into each other, but within tribes you tend to have distinct mythoses, and each story fits into that. So if you just listen to an individual story, it can often be very difficult to comprehend, and it seems extremely incomplete in and of itself, because it is, and that's actually a very beautiful thing about Native American oral narratives, is that they do fit together so distinctly. So oral narratives are a very distinct form of literature, and they do have some importance. So that is just an introduction to exactly what they are. Now, what I'm going to cover next is more talking about the Native American culture, and especially their recent history, where they came from, and why oral narratives would be so needed for them, not just in the past when we think of them being told, but right now in the present day, right as we are speaking, why oral narratives are so important.